A very good morning to all of you. Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations morning briefing. My name is Guntram Wolff and I'm the director of the DGAP. And I'm really happy to host this discussion this morning on Iran, a challenge for European security and German feminist foreign policy. It's a real pleasure to have you all in the call and to have three distinguished speakers today to talk about a very, very important issue. And it is the developments in Iran and the implications for Germany's and European foreign policy. And my starting point is really that there are three major developments in Iran that require to my mind, a fundamental rethink of the European and the German approach to Iran. The first has been ongoing major domestic protests in Iran against the regime, which in particular is supported by women, but not only by women, but the women's role is very important in these protests. So these protests has been ongoing for many, many months, and have sort of slipped away a bit from the headlines, but continue to be ongoing. The second, I think, really important development that is quite recent in the last couple of weeks has been the disclosure that Iran has managed to enrich uranium and is close to having weapon-grade uranium, a significant step towards a nuclear bomb. And the third is really that Iran is and has become a direct threat and is of direct relevance to the security situation in Europe. It is delivering weapons, drones, but not only drones, increasingly also ammunition in significant numbers to Russia. My military experts tell me that the drones have become militarily significant on the battlefield in Ukraine. And so in that sense, Iran is not only sort of squashing domestic protests, but it's also an active actor in the security situation in Europe. And the question is, what can be done about it, and how to act? And for that, we really have three outstanding speakers. We will start with Javaid Rehman. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also a university professor based in London. He will kick us off. Following his intervention, my colleague, Senior Associate Fellow Kerstin Müller, she's a Senior Associate Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and a former Minister of State at the Federal Foreign Office from the Green Party. And last but not least, we have Cornelius Adebahr. He's an Associate Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. So we will, as usual, give each speaker 7 minutes, and then you all will have a chance to interact with our panelists. Javaid, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us at this very early hour from London. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this generous invitation for me to speak to you this morning. I hope I'm audible to you. In this brief presentation, please allow me to provide a brief overview of the human rights situation in Iran. Now, as you would know, that the death in custody of the 22-year-old Jina Mahsa Amini on 16th of September 2022, last year, unleashed one of the strongest waves of protests and civil unrest Iran has seen in the past 4 decades. Jina Mahsa Amini was arrested, and the crime for which she paid the ultimate price of her life was that she was allegedly wearing an improper hijab. Notwithstanding state's denials, there is evidence that she had been assaulted, violently beaten, and mistreated by the police. The killing of this young woman is unfortunately a tragic reflection of the violence against girls and women in Iran. In her case, there are also clear implications with an ethnic and religious dimension, as she was from an ethnically Kurdish background and from a Sunni religious background as well. However, the law of enforced hijab and the manner of its enforcement by state authorities is emblematic of violence, brutality, and the violation of fundamental human rights and human dignity of girls and women of Iran. The manner in which the Iranian regime handled the protests is heart-wrenching and painful to elaborate. Until the end of 2022, over 476 individuals, including at least 64 children and 34 women, have been killed. There are also consistent reports and testimonies of torture and ill treatment of protesters, including allegations of sexual and gender-based violence. Hundreds of protesters have been severely injured and thousands arrested, detained, or incarcerated. By some estimates, over 18,000 individuals were arrested or detained. I'm horrified, shocked, and outraged that despite appeals by the United Nations, including by my own mandate and by the international community, Iranian authorities have thus far executed at least 4 persons associated with protests after arbitrary summary and sham trials, which violated the right to fair trial and due process. I'm very concerned that at least 100 other individuals have been charged with offenses that carry the death penalty and may be either awaiting or undergoing trials. These executions are used as a tool of repression to instill fear, and these are symbols of state brutality. Iran continues to remain a serious threat to regional and international peace and security, with substantial human rights concerns. Amongst the most serious human rights concerns are the deplorable levels of executions, a tool that the regime adopts in order to terrorize its own people, as well as foreign and dual nationals. Persecution, torture, and ill treatment of ethnic, linguistic, and religious and sexual minorities, as well as targeting and victimization of human rights defenders and political activists. The treatment of non-constitutionally unrecognized minorities such as Baha'is and the Christian converts is particularly shocking and appalling. After China, Iran remains the highest executioner of individuals in the world. Last year, at least 500 persons were executed, which included 13 women, and totally contrary to international law, at least 3 children. Amongst these figures is an alarming increase in executions, in particular of drug offender executions, resumption of public executions, and disproportionate use of death penalty against ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities. It is urgent that Iran immediately stops this terrorization of its people through mass executions. The international community cannot engage with a state which continues to violate the dignity and fundamental rights of children, including through their executions. The execution of dual UK Iranian national Mr. Ali Raza Akbari in January 2023 and sentencing to death of German Iranian Jamshed Shermad last month once again highlighted the considerable risks of arbitrary arrest, torture, and other ill treatment, including, as we've seen, executions faced by dual and foreign nationals. Iranian authorities continue to violate human rights of individuals in order to put pressure on foreign governments as a tactic either for prisoner swaps or for other returns. In order to achieve its agenda of threats and generating fear, the Iranian regime actively blocks information. There has been a determined effort to block access to information, including severe internet disruption and censorship of social media platforms. Threats including, in some cases, death threats, harassment, detention, and violence against journalists and media workers has continued. Women journalists have been disproportionately targeted with intimidation and smear campaigns and attacks and harassment through dissemination of false and defamatory information and threats of sexual violence using online platforms and state-controlled media. It is evidently clear that Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been and is a threat to regional as well as global threat to peace and security. The so-called IRGC has supported for various terrorist organizations regionally its consistent violations of territorial integrity of neighboring states, most recently in Iraq, and the raging support of Russia and the provision of drones used in Ukraine is a very serious concern. There must be accountability for such terrorist actions, and while the UN Security Council remains in paralysis to take effective action, individual states must hold Iran and IRGC accountable through individual or collective sanctions, as well as accountability of individuals committing serious human rights and humanitarian law abuses through application of universal jurisdiction. I will simply close by saying that the right to democratic governance, rule of law, and self-determination are ultimately the rights of the people of Iran, which only the people of Iran themselves can claim within the established framework of international human rights law. However, Germany, alongside the international community, can find ways to support this right. Alongside measures of accountability, there must be condemnation and isolation of a regime which blatantly violates the fundamental human rights of Iranian people, and in particular, the rights of women and girls of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javaid, for this excellent overview, and actually quite shocking overview. We already see in the chat that the question about what can we do about the situation, and you mentioned that at the very end, sort of that putting up pressure can help, but perhaps you can just spend 1 minute on explaining what from your point of view can help improve the human rights situation in Iran, how we as outside actors, the German government, other European governments, can actually help with the situation on the ground, protecting the human rights situation of women, but also children and other minority groups in Iran. Perhaps really just 1 minute.
Yes, thank you for this question, an important question. I think that it's very important that Iran and the individuals who are committing gross and very serious violations of human rights are held accountable. So I supported the establishment of the International Fact-Finding Mission, and I'm grateful to Germany and other states who did that. I think that's a very good avenue. I think sanctions should continue. There should be severe sanctions on a state which commits egregious violations of human rights. We should also engage other states, for example, member states of the OIC, and the international community, to bring pressure on the Iranian regime for substantial reform. There has to be an absolute overhaul of the system, in my mind. The current system cannot go on. They have been violating very seriously and for a very long time the rights of all of the Iranian people. So it has to change. And as I said, if it does not change, we must support the Iranian people to bring a change in the system itself, to have an overhaul of the system and the governance structure. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Kerstin Müller. Kerstin has just published on the DGAP blog a very interesting analysis in which she confronts the feminist foreign policy approach with the situation in Iran, and calls for Germany to be more forceful in its action than it is currently, also if it wants to stay true to the principles of feminist foreign policy. Kerstin, please give us your point of view.
Yes, thank you, Guntram, and thank you, Javaid, for this really impressive and shocking report. Thank you all for joining us on this morning. We just heard how devastating the situation in Iran is and how much it has escalated. And I would like at the beginning to remain that we have seen already several uprisings in 2009, 2017, and 2019, and they were all crushed down brutally by the regime. But I think maybe this uprising has two particularities. First of all, it seems to me, Javaid can probably answer to this later on, that this time the regime knows that the uprising could threaten its very existence, and that therefore it is reacting even more brutally. I want to quote a Gamma research study from February 23. According to them, 81% inside Iran oppose the regime and 67% support the protesters. So the regime knows, this is what I hear from a lot of Iranians, the regime knows, it doesn't have a majority anymore in society, and that's probably the beginning of its end, and therefore it's reacting so brutally. And second, it has started this time with a broad women protests on the street, demanding the end of systematic oppression, especially of women, and now also a democratic change of the whole society. The movement is questioning, maybe like never before, I would say, one of the main ideological pillars of the regime, the institutional misogyny, the systematic oppression of women, which was from the beginning, right after the revolution, like the core are very important for them, to build up the whole system. So these are the main reasons. And the question is, how can we react to this? I think that especially the EU and Germany is under a particular pressure, because the government has committed itself, the German government has committed itself to a feminist foreign policy, and just on the 1st of March presented 10 guidelines to implement this policy. And before I criticize the governments, I want to say that I personally think that this feminist foreign policy is really a big step forward. I myself was involved in former times as a Minister of State and later as Member of Parliament in the making of the first German action plan to implement the UN Security Resolution 1325, Women, Peace, Security. And I am convinced that the FFP can change a lot of our foreign policy in the future. But I'm also convinced that an abstract principle, and so far it's not more than an abstract principle, is only worth as much as it passes the test in praxis. So which speaks to my view even more in favor of reassessing the situation in Iran along the principles of the FFP. And this is what I did in my article. And I think when women are leading the revolution on the streets in Iran and risking their lives for their rights, the question arises whether the time hasn't come to implement the FFP in practice and to initiate a fundamental change in Germany, and then in the consequence also in the European Iran policy. So it's kind of like a litmus test for a feminist foreign policy. So what does it mean to take its principles seriously? The Federal Foreign Office FFP policy is based on the so-called 3R+D approach, which means rights, focuses on safeguarding and promoting human and women human rights. Secondly, aims to include the interests of local affected people. It's the principle of representation. And third, resources, provides appropriate resources to protect women and to end marginalized groups. And the D is diversity, which should implement on all of these three levels. Well, rights, we just heard. I don't have to elaborate on human rights. The situation is devastating. And the first reaction of Germany and the EU and the international community was strong. I mean, you cannot say it's weak or, well, it's criticized, but we had a few rounds on the EU level of targeted sanctions. We had a lot of comprehensive resolutions in many parliaments. The national parliaments try to make it easier to get visa for people who have to leave Iran. And I want to mention also, I think Javaid did it, the German-Iranian initiative before the UN Human Rights Council in November 22, which led to the decision to establish an international commission of inquiry regarding the Iranian regime's human rights crimes. This is a big step, but it seems that all these measures are obviously not enough, because so far the regime doesn't seem very impressed. And the Iranian movement in Iran and in exile is demanding much more. And they have the impression that the international community, especially Germany and the EU, is still too reluctant. So in there, you know, the second principle of the FFP, if we take it seriously, it would mean to listen to the Iranian people, to take their will seriously. And here comes the problem, and I think we have to be very honestly about this. You know, Germany and the European policy, and maybe also the international policy, is so reluctant, I think, because we are in a dilemma. Because for years, this so-called nuclear dossier has dominated our and the international relations with Iran. And as a consequence, the systematic human rights violations that the regime has regularly committed have become a minor matter. Nebensache, we say in Germany. I think it sounds hard, but if we are realistic, isn't it like that? It's kind of a sub-topic. And we even, I mean, Biden and the other states which are involved in this format just resumed negotiations in April 2021, when in September the protest started. So what should we do? Also, to not being misunderstood here, I personally convinced that the 2015 agreement was an important diplomatic milestone. And yes, a nuclear weapon-free life and nuclear non-proliferation should be also considered as an important human rights, also according or from a perspective of a feminist foreign policy. But I think in this situation, where it leads to a reluctant reaction of the international community, because at the same time we want to keep the door open to maybe resume these negotiations, in this situation, we really, you know, have to, it's time to take stock of where the Iranian nuclear agreement stands today and whether it has, in general, a chance to succeed and reaching its original goals. So in there, I think we can have a lot of goals. One problem is a lot of doubts. One problem is the Iranian regime has already been unwilling to meet its obligations, latest since 2019. Last year, in 22, it has rejected twice the compromise presented by the international community. And now, just recently, in February, another problem which is weighing heavily, that the IAEA found highly enriched uranium, which has almost a purity level of 90%, so saying weapons grade. It's still under investigations, but the regime openly admitted that it possesses already 60% enriched uranium. And I would like to remember what is in the contract, in the agreement. In the agreement, it says 3.67 is allowed. And we're not talking about the 60% anymore. You know, so what gives us the confidence that the Iranian regime will fulfill its obligations? So I just want to pose these questions. I think that, I don't know, I think I'm convinced that this window of opportunity, it has been there, but maybe it's closed now. It's closed now, and we should come to the conclusion that we can't reach the original goals of this JCPOA, and that they cannot be implemented with a regime in a foreseeable future, with a regime which we should bring before the criminal court in Den Haag and not negotiate with them. So I come to the conclusion the Iran deal is now politically dead. Even Rafael Grossi, the president, says it's kind of an empty shell. And I think that the international community, that this would be an important step, an important signal to the movement in Iran of solidarity to state that officially, to say the game is over. We can't negotiate with you while you are treating your people on the streets like you do, to gain back credibility, and also to to have more space to do the other measures, to really keep accountable the regime, to work with the Inquiry Commission and so on. So I think it's not a symbolic measure, but it would be a very important step, and according also a feminist foreign policy.
Right.
We can say the best guarantee for a nuclear-free Iran of tomorrow is the democratic Iran of today, and we should count on that in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kerstin, for these very clear words and really calling out the dilemma and highlighting that in your assessment, the nuclear deal is dead, and it's high time to call it dead and increase the pressure. The next speaker is Cornelius, please.
Thank you, Guntram. Thanks to DGAP for hosting this event. It's great that DGAP is covering this topic continuously, and I'm particularly happy to take the floor after my two distinguished co-panelists, after Javaid presented the human rights situation in Iran and Kerstin spoke about the feminist foreign policy requirements. I can now speak about the German approach, which is fitting because the German approach is basically a combination of those two issues presented beforehand. But I will add another the geopolitical angle here, because I believe Iran is emblematic of the conflicts that are to come after Zeitenwende. And so it is important to look at the bigger picture also. So presenting what Germany has done in a matter-of-fact way. I'm not defending the German government here, but I'm just summarizing a little bit. My two previous speakers have also alluded to parts of what Germany has done, so I can be short on some of those aspects. I would say the approach of Germany has been initially slow, but increasingly sharp. We've seen statements from the foreign minister, harsh statements, not mincing her words. We even saw statements belatedly, but still from the chancellor, which is remarkable because if you followed the Iran file for a little longer, you may recall that Chancellor Angela Merkel, his predecessor, hardly ever touched on the Iran issue. It was somehow not chancellor-worthy to her to be dealing with these issues. So there has been no doubt about where the German government stands. We have seen debates in the Bundestag, at least 3 of them public debates, where the government had to defend its course against an opposition pressing hard, an opposition, even a conservative opposition, suddenly becoming feminist in their demands when it comes to what the government should be doing on Iran. The German government has also been driving the EU sanctions response. We've seen 5 packages of sanctions, of EU sanctions, since October 22, targeting individuals, the organizations responsible for repression, which basically means asset freezes and visa bans. So amongst others, high-ranking members of the Revolutionary Guards, they've been mentioned quite a number of times already, members of the so-called morality police, provincial governors, members of parliament, of the Iranian parliament, and government ministers. Also, because of the propaganda that is taking place inside the country, the broadcasting agency, TV stations, communication agencies, they have been put on the EU sanctions list. Then there is the multilateral response, and I'm grateful to Javaid to have already mentioned the Human Rights Council meeting in November, which established an independent reporting mechanism, a fact-finding mechanism, which is crucial if we are ever to achieve some accountability for the crimes that have taken place, the human rights violations, the gross human rights violations. That is something which Germany and others have been pushing for. And finally, there has been a remarkable cooling of bilateral relations between Germany and Iran. Very early on, the German Foreign Office presented an action plan of measures that they wanted to take to freeze the remaining ties, especially in business, whatever was left of business, but also academic and other exchanges, something that I personally regret, because I feel we are also giving up a lot if we're cutting all those ties. But this has been part of the German government's response. There's also some support. There can be more, again, my personal view, but there has been some support for civil society inside the country and in the region, and also individual protection schemes for persons, Iranians, that are persecuted inside the country and that have to leave the country for their own safety. And lastly, just the other week, an expulsion of Iranian diplomats in response to the death sentence that was put out for Jamshid Sharmat, a German-Iranian national, co-national with American residency. We saw retaliation by the Iranians expelling German diplomats. So this is really the situation in terms of bilateral relations, diplomatic relations, is as it has never been before. But what does that mean for the geopolitical angle, which I wanted to briefly touch upon? Well, Iran is, and one has to say it so clearly, Iran is the only country that is materially supporting Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine by delivering drones, possibly also soon delivering missiles. There's talk of building a drone factory inside Russia. And there is also, again, talk of Russia paying back with sending fighter jets to Iran. So we do see an increased level and a new level of military cooperation between Russia and Iran, something that was previously more confined to the nuclear file that was under the international regulations, clearly wanted from all sides. And then some sanctions evading because Iran is so good at it. And now we see a new level of military cooperation. We also see, and that is very unfortunate, an increased level of confrontation with Israel. We hear from the old new Netanyahu government that they are preparing plans for a military strike. They are getting US support. The US ambassador to Israel is on record saying, we trust that Israel knows what they are doing and we'll have their back. So this is a clear warning sign that we may see a military confrontation in the region over the Iranian-Israeli enmity. And we can see that Iran has is no longer looking east as it did for a number of years already, but it is more in a lock-in with the anti-West. It is cozying up with China. It is looking to become a full-fledged member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So there is some built-in drifting away. I mean, it's never been in the camp of the West, but it was somehow playing also the non-aligned card for some time. And it is now increasingly locked in with those Russia, China, that could be part of this coming confrontation, as many say. And lastly, I would say the nuclear file also is a geopolitical challenge, and I wouldn't only see it under the guise of the current protests. What could be done on the nuclear file in order to support the protests, but it is a threat per se. It is something that needs to be tackled, and where the Europeans, the Americans, need to keep their eye on because of simply the regional ramifications and the end of the global non-proliferation regime that this might spell. So for this, I'm just laying out the challenges as I see them, and I'm happy to get into more details in the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cornelius, also for adding these very important thoughts, and again, also reminding us of the broader geopolitical situation. We have now time for questions, and please do raise your hand and put on your camera. Then you can ask a question directly here in the audience, but you can also, of course, put questions in the chat, and I can ask these questions to my panelists. But I really would appreciate getting a few live interventions, because that makes it much more interesting also for our panelists and much more lively. And I think since I don't yet see anybody raising the hand, I will read the spicy comment that came in at 8:31, so 1 minute after the start. That was a prepared question by Ingo Kahle. So Mrs. Baerbock needed a long time to blame the Müller regime for the abuse of human rights. Why do German left-wing feminists have their difficulties to name this regime in Iran what it is? Felonious, infamous, and in its core over and over corrupt. They even poison pupils in school with gas. Even UN Secretary General Guterres did not find a single word in his speech at Women's Day to blame the abuse of women in Iran. For example, the permanent, systematic, and brutal rape in prisons. Must all these courageous women in Iran fight for their freedom without at least the moral support of the world's democratic community? Now, these are very strong and harsh words, which I think deserve to be discussed. And, you know, perhaps, I don't know, Cornelius, did you want to react, or Kerstin, did you want to react to that? Perhaps Cornelius, you start, and then, or Kerstin, you start, and then Cornelius, please.
This is my interpretation. I think he's, I mean, I wouldn't criticize it that harsh, because I think especially Annalena Baerbock is very clear. She is very outspoken. She is actually most of the time criticized to be too outspoken. But as Cornelius said, Germany and also the EU were slow in their reaction, and you can feel this reluctance. And this is what also the democratic movements in Iran, but also here in exile, is criticizing. They feel that Germany is not really on their side, not as they are on the side of Ukraine. You know, they always have, like, you know, how the situation in Ukraine is. If you look at the debate at the Munich Security Conference, you know, that was a very important point in the discussion. And my interpretation is that they are so reluctant because there is the dilemma with the Iranian nuclear file. Also, if you go to Borrell on the EU level, you know, Borrell says he has judicial reasons, legal reasons why it's not possible to list the Revolutionary Guards on the EU terror list. And I'm a lawyer, jurist myself. You will always find reasons. You can argue almost everything. And to say in this situation, sorry, we can't do it as the EU, a national country has to go first, you know, it's not really convincing. And I think the political reason behind this is that the EU wants to keep a door open. They want to keep a door open. And of course, it's a serious topic, Cornelius said. You know, the risk, the danger of an Iran having nuclear weapons, of course. But the question is, if these former agreements, if we can revive and if it has any chance to prevent Iran from having the weapons. Israel was mentioned. I didn't mention it in my introductory words, but Israel is a main, I mean, I lived there for many years and I'm very into Israeli national politics, and Iran, 90% of the Israeli are afraid of an Iranian bomb. And we must be aware that Israel, if the international community doesn't try to integrate Israel in a comprehensive strategy how to deal with Iran, they will act by themselves. They will act by themselves. And as far as I hear, there are signals by the US indeed that they at least, you know, targeted strike, something like this, you know, that they have kind of a support. So I wouldn't be so harsh, but there is a reluctance.
Right. So let me bring in Hans-Jochen Schmidt, who raised the hand, and then give Cornelius and Javaid also a chance to react, because there was also the issue of the UN and Guterres. So So Hans-Jochen Schmidt, please.
Referring to the latest Kerstin Müller's comments about the need, how to more or less to exercise a certain, how do you say, understanding of Israel to get integrated into our political efforts, how to contain, the nuclear development there. But what from your point of view, and that is to Adebahr's evaluation, and of course it's difficult to discuss this item, how high is the probability of a military targeted strike of Israel how do you say, to stop the enrichment process. In the past, Israel was successful in partially destroying the centrifuge, as far as I know, installations. And now with the Netanyahu government, I think far more nationalistic, far more defending its stance, and seeing the danger of more or less realization of producing the bomb. How difficult will it be for us to hold back Israel to undertake a military strike? And what is your evaluation, Mr. Adebahr?
Thank you, and thank you also for the question. I will try to respond to a couple of points that have been made so far. First, about the comment in the chat, Ingo Kahle. I wouldn't, rehash who reacted when and who was slow. I said in my statement the German government's response was slow, but it had become much more forcefully. So, just count on that. Don't go back to how you were not satisfied with an initial response. If you look at the statements of the past 5 months, there is clarity as to where Germany stands. So there is no doubting the nature of the regime, as you describe it, amongst German official statements. Where people disagree, obviously, is on the course of action. And I wouldn't call it holding a door open as Kerstin does, because that sounds so mischievous, so some, like having second thoughts and not going all in. But there are practical and very understandable reasons for not doing certain things, like not listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, because it does more harm than it does good. It's pure symbolism. It doesn't help people on the streets in Tehran or anywhere else in Iran. It only worsens the situation for people inside the country, because then we have a regime which is with a back to the wall and which will lash out against anything even more, and we don't have any more avenues to talk to the regime if we designate what is an official military organization, military body as a terrorist organization. And I would also not call the JCPOA dead or declare it that way. I mean, as an analyst, I can use many different words for the state of the JCPOA. It's been on life support for quite a long time. But unilaterally declaring it dead and saying we're ending the negotiations, which haven't been going on for half a year anyway, would be a mistake. I mean, I don't see this enhancing the security of Israel if Iran feels freed from any of the obligations. So the debate that one can have and should have is about which course of action, and again there should be arguments made for one course or the other, but it is not to fundamentally question the predisposition of the German government in being fully against what is going on in Iran.
Yeah. Okay, but wonderful, thank you. But Cornelius, I think we have a couple of questions here really going in this. And Javaid, I want to bring you in, but let me get 2-3 more questions in, and then you have a word. I mean, so really what I think people are worried about is that basically we are continuing as we did before, using a few harsher words, and that's a bit. I mean, if I characterize what you're saying is basically we continue, but we use harsher words, and okay, we withdraw a few diplomats. I mean, that's not going to help the women and the demonstrators on the street. So what can be done really to change the situation on the ground? And before you answer, I want to hear from Mina Mazari, who raised her hand, just to bring also her perspective in. Mina, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for this talk. I just want to answer to Mr. Adebahr. And the people in Iran would really appreciate a listing of the IRGC, and it would not be a backstep, and it would not enforce more brutality against them. There cannot be more brutality against protesters that are already shut down in the streets, poisoned in the schools, and are executed for trivialities. And moreover, if the listing of the RGC is only a symbolic symbol and it does not help, why is the EU so reluctant to do so?
Yeah. Exactly, that's the question. I was going to ask this. I mean, maybe Cornelius can. Why are we not listing them? It's not going to do harm, and the protesters are demanding it. Although maybe some of them, you know, as you said, like wie sagt man, Freiwillige, Jugendliche sind in der RGC, are, you know, they are part of it, and they will be touched. I don't understand. Why not? Why don't we list them? It's a political. I'm convinced it has a political reason. We don't want to be too harsh. We don't want to be too harsh. Well, because we want to keep channels open to discuss, of course, important topic, and we still hope we can, you know, prevent Iran from going nuclear.
I mean, if I should respond now, Guntram, you.
Sorry, I was intervening.
You want a different order.
No, but you know, I think it's a sort of very good discussion, and I think this is really the core question when it comes to the German response. And so perhaps you want to react to that, and then I bring in the next round of questions and get also Javaid in the game. Please. Okay,
so happy to. I can try to put myself in the head of a decision maker. So what I do see is I do see the symbolism, but I don't see the positive effect, and I see a number of negative effects. Kerstin, you mentioned people that have been drafted into the IRGC, which you know, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, who did their military service with the IRGC would be labeled members of a terrorist organization for the rest of their lives. We have seen these effects when the United States labeled the IRGC as a terrorist organization. This has affected individuals inside the United States, people that have left the country a long time ago because they don't agree with the government or with the regime in Iran, and they are affected now. So that is one thing, and that's going into the hundreds of thousands of people that have been drafted into the IRGC. The second effect is that, again, from a human rights perspective, the IRGC basically runs the country. It's not just an army, but it is a huge a huge economic actor. So shutting down any or listing them as a terrorist organization would ultimately, in addition to what the sanctions that are already there, would make it difficult for any outside actor, civil society organizations, NGOs, to interact with Iranian institutions because the IRGC can be behind anything. And that's another downside. And then this idea of not closing all doors or not cutting all ties, well, if you have an overall balance of considerations to make, and you are asked to push that one button, which will end most of all relations with the government, and you have so many issues, the dual nationals that you have to take care of, the nuclear file, the relations, the regional relations, and with Israel. If you are to end all of this for a symbolism that may be demanded by the people in Iran, but doesn't effectively help them, you know, then I can understand those decision makers who say, well, we're not going down this path.
Javaid, I think we need a bit of your wisdom, and then I bring in the next round of questions, please.
I've been listening to this very interesting conversation, so thank you to all colleagues, and thank you for the questions. Now, you see, there are some historic and contemporary dilemmas which the international community, including the United Nations, face. So one of the big dilemmas is about state sovereignty and engagement with the state. So while we want to engage with the state, albeit an undemocratic, authoritarian, powerful state which does not respect human rights, the question is how far the human rights and human rights law can go. And that has been a very serious challenge. So when we are talking about the door half open and half shut, that is the problem. That where does, to what extent you can intervene. And I can say to you that in my own mandate, my intervention has been and is quite limited by my very mandate. I'm expected to engage with the Iranian regime, and I do engage with them. But when they decide to commit such gross violations of human rights and decide not to engage with me, then I have very limited resource at my hand. And when I speak about resources, I speak about Iranians not giving me access to the country. They've not given me access in the mandate that I've held since July 2018, and they have not allowed access to any of my predecessors since the mandate was renewed in 2011. And with limited resources that I have at my disposal, I produce reports, I do communications, I talk to people like yourself. But at the end of the day, my mandate and in fact, the international community has been quite reluctant to not go a step further. As I have said on many occasions, after due consideration, I have come to the view that this particular regime is not going to reform. They are not going to change its ways. They will not address the human rights issues. We have been talking to them for a long time about women's rights, about rights of minorities, about rights of its own people, about democracy, the framework, but it's not happening. So I have very reluctantly come to the conclusion that the system must be overhauled. And therefore, I say to you that there has to be a global consensus that this system cannot go on anymore. We must bring on board those countries which are still sitting on the fence, as it were. And that speaks to my own country, Pakistan, where I come from. That speaks to many of the OIC countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, in the Middle East. They have to recognize that this is an apartheid regime. It has to go. There is no space for it. I've already mentioned to you the issue of accountability. Many of the people who hold high governmental positions are alleged to have committed very serious crimes in international law. And and you know what I mean. I speak about the president of Iran right now, people right at the top, the supreme leader, members of the IRGC. When these individuals are alleged to have committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, I do not see a problem with accountability and holding individuals to account, including designating individuals as terrorists when they are doing terrorist activities. I gave you examples of what they did in Iraq. They have been bombing Iraq for a long time, since the protest started. They have been supporting the Russians in war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I do not see an issue in the international community going further and holding these individuals to account, including designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your clear words. The regime cannot be reformed. It must be overhauled. Is a sort of very clear sentence, and also your clear statement on the National Guard, I think is a very important statement, of course, in this conversation. And I do want to sort of ask the question that James Willie asked, which is really about the non-proliferation protocols that have been clearly not effective. Iran's clear violation on these protocols, and why so long insisting on a constructive engagement strategy towards Iran. And he's pushing the JCPOA further, the question asking, well, it was anyway deeply flawed from the beginning, inadequate inspection, the sunset clause, the exclusion of missile restrictions, which is, of course, a big issue now that Iranian-Russian cooperation continues and deepens. The probability that Iran might achieve and might get the necessary missile technology to deliver the nuclear weapon is also increasing to my mind. So this becomes really a much bigger issue here. And so really, again, I think this nuclear question, how to deal with this nuclear question, is a question that's really of great interest to our listeners, and I think to the world, I would say. But let's bring in the question by Boris Ginsburg, and then I think we have a final short statement by each of you, and we have to conclude. Boris, please.
Hi, thank you. A question, I would have a question about Iran, but about the concept of feminist foreign policy to Frau Müller, if I may. I think it's a very interesting concept, especially when we think about how to tackle certain security challenges in the world. But there's one thing that I found a little bit contradictory in this concept. So the main call of feminist foreign policy is also to stop thinking in binary terms, especially in international politics, like thinking only of war and peace, or other binary pairs like strong and weak, democracy, autocracy. But if we apply a feminist foreign policy, what I see is that actually we are just replacing one binary pair with another one. Namely, for example, the binary term democracy, autocracy is replaced by the binary pair feminist and anti-feminist. So actually, in its core, it seems to me that feminist foreign policy is paradoxically anti-feminist, because they just replace one binary pair with another one.
Okay, thank you. I think this question is clear. Thank you so much. Then we move back to our three panelists, and I would say we go in reverse order. So Cornelius, Kerstin, and Javaid. And then we have to conclude in 3 minutes. So each of you has 1 minute.
Okay, I'll be quick then, and I cannot touch on all the points, which is why I've just put a link into the chat to a publication from earlier this year that I co-authored with Barbara Mittelhammer, late last year, where we sketch what we believe is a feminist response to the revolt, the ongoing revolt, and which lists a number of measures that the German government, the European governments, the EU could take in terms of supporting civil society inside the country, outside, within the diaspora, establishing links, for example, for supporting IT infrastructure, payments that could be made, helping individuals to protect them from persecution. So rather than engaging in the symbolism that I see doesn't do help, but does more harm, I would like to see some substantive support from the German government on civil society. On the nuclear file, just one remark. I lived in Iran from 2011 to 2013, and that was enough for me to know that the regime needs to be overhauled, that there needs to be a different regime, and that it's not about reform from the inside. So it's again, for many people, it's something that has been out there for a long time, and it's not just now. But for the nuclear file, I mean, as I said, this is an issue of geopolitical concern. It's not just a question of blowing it into the air just because one has other issues to deal with. I don't think we can speak about the nuclear file without mentioning the United States withdrawing from the JCPOA in 2018, which has brought us into the situation of Iran reneging on its own commitment. So maybe that's a point where one could start. And I also don't see, as someone suggested in the chat, that it's simply easy to discourage Israel from striking militarily when one calls the JCPOA off, because then there are no more restrictions on Iran anyway. So unfortunately, no easy answers, but lots to discuss. Thank you.
Kerstin.
Well, in 1 minute, I can't touch on everything. Maybe this very important point Javaid said in his statement, we can only overhaul, we cannot reform it. And here again, the Iran negotiations had also an indirect goal. One of the goals, it was not only, the main goal was to prevent Iran from going nuclear. I'm convinced in this format, we're not going to reach there. And we were lifting sanctions, by the way, because in the chat, somebody was saying we're having sanctions for 40 years. But during this whole process, there was also a lifting of sanctions. And there's the demand of the movement of experts that the European sanctions are not on the level before the whole process started, are not on the level the US has at the moment. So there is space, there's much more space. Because the alternative, of course, to negotiations, which are not going on now, but to say it's over, the game is over, before the devastating human rights aren't stopped on the ground, we're not going to talk with you anymore, and we don't see, that you will stop the Iranian nuclear program. So one goal was that we can support the reformer, that we will be able indirectly, to kind of split the regime. And this is over also. We can't see I don't see any reformers within the regime who take position or take side for the movement and their demands, or who take side for any human rights. So, also this is over. And therefore, I think really we have to count on a democratic change in Iran. And this is a guarantee in the future that, that we can prevent the nuclear bomb, which isn't there yet.
Thank you. And Javaid, you have the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all my colleagues. I think much have been said already. I will just reiterate by where when I presented my opening statement. The human rights situation in Iran is extremely unfortunate. It's very tragic. We are all aware of that. I think the cosmetic changes will not work anymore. We have to consider a whole-scale overhauling of the system. I think we must support the people of Iran to decide for their own future. And that should be our main goal, that people of Iran must decide for themselves, living in a democratic country, deciding their own fate, but we must support these people. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you, Cornelius, Adebahr, Kerstin, Müller, Javaid Rehman. It was really a pleasure to discuss this important topic. It was a difficult topic, and I learned a lot, and I think I get already a lot of feedback here in the chat, how grateful our audience is. So thank you so much also for engaging with us in the discussion, to all of our participants. Until next time, bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.